Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anupama, Professor at Department of Economics, Punjabi University, Patiala. I am going to talk about the module Employment and Urban Labour Markets from Population, Urbanization and Poverty. So students, we are going to discuss about the changes in trends and structure of employment along with the process of urbanization. We will also discuss the trends and patterns of unemployment along with the structure transformation of the economy. The main objectives of this module are to examine the concept of structure transformation, the theoretical background of shift of labor force from rural to urban areas, the characteristics of employment in India in general and urban employment in particular, the unemployment rate in urban areas, the variations in urban unemployment rates according to education and age. Over the last few decades, the growth and change in the developing world has also been associated with growing size of urban labor markets. Usually, we associate the urbanization of labor force with structure transformation of the economy. The dualistic growth models say that agriculture sector or the rural market has a limited capacity to absorb the ever-growing labor force. Therefore, the surplus labor necessarily moves to the urban areas. Lewis visualized the movement of the unlimited supply of labor to be absorbed by the capitalist sector of the economy. He indicates urban labor market acts as a powerful engine for stimulating growth and economic transformation. This model, however, ignored the distributional aspects and visualized that the surpluses and deficits in the labor supply will be automatically adjusted through the market forces. However, the model by Harris and Todaro seemed to be filling this vacuum by introducing various supply-side assumptions conducive to disequilibrium in the urban labor market. This model argues that if increases in labor supply are greater than the urban demand, there will be an increase in urban unemployment or informal employment, and the stock of the unemployed and underemployed may be quite large before some sort of equilibrium is reached. This model inspired the contemporary research to focus upon the urban labor market and the implications of its dualism. The subsequent theories put forth the idea of wage rigidity in the urban markets and existence of a less accessible, more favored urban modern sector and easily accessible but low paid informal sector. However, it was assumed that employment in the informal sector would only be transitory in nature and would provide a training ground for the workers who would be absorbed by the modern informal sector after some time. Therefore, it is important here to look at a few theoretical considerations of the employment in urban areas. Lewis started with the assumption of the unlimited supply of labor in the countries where population is so large relative to capital and natural resources that there are large sectors of the economy where the marginal productivity of labor is negligible, zero or even negative. This indicates that this pool of workers can be used in productive sectors of the economy at no addition in real cost. The subsistence wages at which the surplus labor is available for employment is determined by the cost of subsistence and is equal to the average product per man in subsistence agriculture plus a margin. Lewis further states that in such an economy, employment expands in a capitalist sector as capital formation occurs, and this results in rising share of profits in national income. Therefore, as capitalist sector expands, profits grow relatively, an increasing proportion of income is reinvested, resulting in increase in income and employment in the economy. Thus, according to Lewis, the growth of the economy is synonymous with growth of investment and employment in the capitalist sector. Since in a dual economy, the capitalist sector is mainly located in urban areas, we can easily fit in the Lewisian framework to urban labor markets in developing countries. However, in this sector, the workers will be employed up to the point where the marginal productivity of labor equals the current wage rate. This is illustrated in figure 1. The horizontal axis measures the quantity of labor, the vertical axis its marginal product. There is a fixed amount of capital, OW is the current wage, if the marginal product of labor was outside capitalist sector, OR are to be employed. But the rational capitalist would employ only OM workers at the given wage rate, as by employing this much of the workers, the wage rate is equal to the marginal product in this sector. The figure shows that OMPW is the total wage bill and WPN is the capitalist surplus. The workers outside this sector, that is beyond point M, earn what they can in the subsistence sector of the economy. The key to the development process and the absorption of additional labor force by the capitalist sector depends upon the reinvestment by the capitalist sector. As it is reinvested, the capitalist sector expands, taking more people into capitalist employment out of the subsistence sector. The surplus is then larger, lending to more capital formation and more employment in the capitalist sector, and so the process continues under the labor process disappears. This process is shown in figure 2. In figure 2, OS are the average subsistence earnings and OW is the wage rate in the capitalist sector. WN1 Q1 represents the surplus in the initial stage. Since some of this is reinvested, the amount of fixed capital increases. Hence, the schedule of the marginal productivity of labor is now raised to the level of N2 Q2. Both the surplus and capitalist employment are now larger. Further, reinvestment raises the schedule of marginal productivity of labor to N3 Q3, and the process continues so long as there is surplus labor. Thus, this model states that the employment in the capitalist sector can be raised by reinvestment of surplus in the capitalist sector, or say urban sector in the current framework. Harris-Todaro model explains some issues of rural-urban migration. This migration happens in case when expected urban income is higher than the rural wages. In this case, the economy may have higher rates of unemployment. The equilibrium condition of this model is when expected urban wage is equal to the rural wage. A brief description of this model is as follows. This model is based upon some general assumptions. This assumes that there are two sectors. One is the urban sector or the manufacturing sector. Another is the rural sector, which represents agriculture. The second assumption is regarding rural-urban migration, which says that migration occurs when urban real wages exceed real agricultural product. There is no marginal cost. There is perfect competition into the economy. The Cobb-Douglas production function operates. This model is actually a static approach. This model shows that there is low risk aversion. This model states that the migration of the workers to the urban labor market is a function of real difference in wages that largely depends upon the nominal difference in rural and urban wages and probability of getting a job in the urban areas. In many developing countries, the wages in the city, even adjusted for cost of living, can greatly exceed wages in rural areas. However, workers who migrate to the cities are not employed for sure, as there are fewer jobs than applicants for them. Therefore, the probability of getting a job is equal to lambda into n divided by s minus n. Here, S is total urban labor supply and N shows number of employed workers. Further, the real difference in wages, that is D, depends upon the probability of getting job, that is pi, rural wages, that is R, and urban wages, W. And this can be represented as D is equal to W into pi minus R. This real difference is the decisive factor behind migration decision. People go on migrating until this real difference disappears. This can be understood with help of figure 3. In figure 3, there are two sectors, agriculture and manufacturing. Each sector has a specific factor, that is agriculture, which is a function of land, manufacturing, which is a function of capital, and labor, which is mobile between these two sectors. In this model, we assume that prices of agricultural and manufacturing goods are constant. The horizontal axis shows total labor force. The marginal product curves are LL dash for agriculture, MM dash for manufacturing. O star W is the fixed minimum wage in manufacturing, and corresponding employment is given at NO star. According to Harris-Todaro, in equilibrium, the expected urban wage must be equal to the agricultural wage. We draw a rectangular hyperbola through J and let it intersect LL dash at R. This is the indifference curve of migration. On this curve, the rural and urban workers would be having same satisfaction as there would be no real difference in their wages. This gives agricultural wage OV and rural employment OG. The remaining part GN will be unemployed pool. Manufacturing wage bill NJWO star rectangular area is spread over the whole urban labor force. Manufacturing wage bill NJWO star rectangular area is spread over the whole urban labor force. And we get the expected urban wage GR, which is the average of minimum wage O star W received by the employed and the zero wage received by the unemployed. Since two shaded areas are equal, the expected urban wage is equal to the rural wage. These theories have focused upon the dual nature of urban markets and the wage differentials therein. However, if we switch to the dominant informal character of urban labor market, much of the theories are not so close to the reality, as there exists a significant group of people who are neither employed in modern sector jobs nor unemployed. They occupy an intermediate position, sometimes called underemployed, whereby they are working, hence not unemployed, but the work was by no means modern, nor that, but the work was by no means modern, nor for that matter was the pay. A number of authors studied this sector and made its characteristics known. The result is the widespread recognition of what has come to be called as urban informal sector. The criteria for informal sector identified in ILO report on Kenya 1972 were ease of entry, reliance of indigenous resources, family ownership of enterprises, and small scale of operation. This also includes labor-intensive and adapted technology, skilled acquired outside the formal school system, and unregulated and competitive markets. Informal sector activities are largely ignored, rarely supported, often regulated, and sometimes actively discouraged by the government. Thus, we find that urban labor markets in developing countries are dichotomous. On the one hand, there is a formal labor market, and on the other hand, there is the informal labor segment, which is in many ways a result of failure of the formal segment to create sufficient job opportunities for the urban population. In many developing countries, wage employment in the modern sector has fallen in absolute terms over time. This situation has been made worse in the 80s and 90s by retrenchment in the public sector in most of these economies. Since much of the formal sector employment in developing countries is concentrated in and around urban locations, they have had clear repercussions on urban employment. The failure of urban employment in the modern private sector has led to a rapid expansion of informal sector. The share of urban employment in the informal sector is quite high and is estimated to be above 75% in the developing world. Thus, the informal sector plays an important role in urban employment. As we have already discussed, the growth of the urban labor market mainly depends upon the shifts in the structure of the economy from agriculture to non-agriculture sector. Therefore, the growth of urban labor market largely depends upon the speed and pattern of structure transformation of the economy. The typical pattern involves initially a shift from an agriculture to an industrial economy through industrialization, which further leads to the rising importance of the service and tertiary sector even at the expense of industry or the transition to a service economy. Along with this growth pattern, we can easily observe the changes in pattern of employment. Although these patterns are assumed to be similar across countries, but the countries which have opened up their economies in the developing stage, that is when the industrial sector was not fully grown, the tertiarization of employment can begin at lower levels of income than it had in case of the developed countries. We can easily understand these patterns in case of India. The Indian strategy of growth has envisaged employment as a secondary objective with greater focus on development of the industry and agriculture, assuming that issue of unemployment would automatically be resolved in the due course. Further, it was also believed that with the expansion of the public sector and large-scale organized private sector, the quality of employment would not be any problem. Employment generation drew policy attention in the middle of the 70s, when after 2 decades of planned industrial and agricultural growth, it was felt that the growth has not brought desired results, and poverty and unemployment has increased in the economy. Further, during the 90s, when India adopted the new economic policy, the role of the public sector shrank. It was expected that the private sector would generate more jobs in the less regulatory framework, but that decade virtually observed a jobless growth. And most of the newly created employment opportunities were informal in character. Outside agriculture, greater number of people are employed in urban areas. Therefore, the liberalization of the economy had greater impact on employment in urban areas. A look at the long-term trends in employment in Table 1 shows that employment in the urban areas has always grown at a greater rate as compared to their rural counterparts. During 1999-2000 to 2009-10, the growth of employment in urban areas was 3.10% per annum as compared to only 0.96% in rural areas. It can also be observed that the growth of employment in the secondary sectors is higher than that of the other sectors during the decade 1999-2000 to 2009-10. Outside the primary sector, employment is commonly understood to mean a job with a wage or salary. In India, major part of employment, however, consists of self-employment. Even though the share of this category in total employment has been declining, as is expected in the process of modern economic development, it still accounts for majority of the workers. This category is very heterogeneous as it includes not only the employers and working owners but also the unpaid family workers. For these workers, since there is no employer-employee relationship, the earnings are likely to fluctuate with slightest of the fluctuation in the market. Although high-income earning group, the professionals, the doctors, businessmen are also included in this category, but a large majority includes the persons having own farm, small enterprise and family labor. Therefore, for an average person, in terms of quality of employment, self-employment is only second to the regular wage work. Hence, the regular wage is found to have the best score. It generally provides regularity and stability of employment, relatively better earnings, job security, and social security. Casual labor category is the worst in these terms. However, in India, even though the employment in self-employed category has declined, giving way to the wage employment, yet the pattern of this shift is not similar in rural and urban areas. In rural areas, a greater proportion of the workforce has shifted to casual workers, while in urban areas, this is more towards the regular employment. Urban areas have a greater share of their workers in regular employment as compared to rural ones. And these differences are quite remarkable as Table 2 shows that in 2009-10, the share of regular workers in rural areas was 7.3% only as compared to 41.4% in the urban areas. On the other hand, the casual employment in the urban areas is just half of the share in the rural areas in the same category. This indicates a relatively better quality of employment in urban areas as compared to the rural ones. The quality of employment in urban areas can also be judged by the sectoral distribution of the workers. It has been observed that although the workforce has been shifting itself from primary activities to secondary and tertiary activities, yet this shift is rather slower in rural areas vis-a-vis the urban ones. Naturally, in urban areas, more workers are employed in secondary and tertiary sector. The rural-urban differences in the relative shares of these two sectors are quite remarkable in the year 2009. about 61% of male workers and 36% of the female workers in urban areas are employed in secondary activities, and about 32% of the male workers and 50% of the female workers are employed in the services. These ratios were only about 20 and 13% for males and females in secondary activities, and around 10% and 5% for males and females in tertiary activities in rural areas. Thus, urban areas provide better jobs as compared to the rural ones. But the quality of employment can only be judged from the employment outcomes. As we know that the employment in India is largely informal in character, and the informality is equally higher in non-agriculture sector. Therefore, the higher share of workers in urban areas in non-agricultural activities does not simply mean higher standard of living of urban workers as compared to their rural counterparts. This picture becomes clearer if we look at the distribution of workers according to the average wages earned by them. Table 3 clearly shows that for all types of workers, the wages in urban areas are higher as compared to the rural areas. These differences are much wider in case of regular workers, while for casual workers working in the public works, we can see very small differences vis-a-vis the other categories of the workers. Since a significant proportion of the urban workers work in regular jobs, a higher level of wages for them automatically indicates higher average wages in urban areas than those prevailing in the rural areas. Higher wages in urban areas should mean higher standard of living or lower poverty rates for the urban workers. But the cost of living is also higher in the urban areas as compared to the rural areas. Therefore, the difference in nominal wages may not be a true indicator of the difference in poverty rates. Moreover, only those laborers who have the access to job market are able to get the higher wages in urban areas. It is generally believed that the urban labor markets are less accessible to the poor categories of the labor force. Therefore, it is important to examine the work participation rate across various quintile groups in urban areas. The Ministry of Labour and Employment, in its second annual report to the people on employment in 2012, calculated the work participation rate according to the quintile groups. It divided the workers among the poorest, second poorest, middle, second richest, and the richest groups. A comparison of the rural and urban work participation rates according to the quintile groups has been shown in Table 5. The table shows that although the work participation rate in urban areas is lower than the rural areas, but the work participation rate among the poorest categories is not only lower than the rural counterparts, but it is also lower than the average work participation rate in the urban areas. Further, the distribution of the workers according to the quintile groups shows that both in rural and urban areas, the poorest category is more employed in the casual jobs and in self-employment, while the richer groups has its greater hold on regular jobs. Thus, the excess of poor is lower to the regular jobs as compared to the richer quintile class. However, the urban markets seem to provide more regular employment opportunities to the poor classes as compared to the rural areas, where these scarce jobs become further scarcer for the poor workers. It is also being felt that when the crisis started having its impact on the Indian labor market, it is the people at the margins, that is the poorest groups, which bore the biggest brunt of this crisis. Further, the distribution of the workers according to quintile groups shows that both in rural and urban areas, the poorest category is more employed in casual jobs and in self-employment, while the richer groups has its greater hold on the regular jobs. Thus, the access of the poor is lower to the regular jobs as compared to the richer quintile class. However, the urban labor markets seems to provide more regular employment opportunities to the poor classes as compared to the rural areas, whereas these scarce jobs becomes further scarcer for the poor workers. It is also being felt that when the crisis started having its impact on the Indian labor market, it is the people at the margins that the poorest groups which bore the biggest brunt of the crisis. Unemployment is commonly viewed as a serious problem in India. Such tendencies, apart from depriving the masses to improve the livelihood options, also lead to widening inequalities in the labor market. In urban India, the rate of unemployment is higher than the rural areas, but this gap has narrowed down over a period of time. This can be observed from Table 5, which shows that the rate of unemployment in India has come down from 8.8% in 1977-78 to only 3.8% in 2011-12, while the rural India has registered a fall of 1 percentage points in its rate of unemployment during the same period. This has led to a fall in rural-urban gap in unemployment rates, which has reduced from a gap of 5.5 percentage points to only 1.5 percentage points. One reason of this narrowing gap is generally cited to be casualization of labor force, as most of the workers find one and another casual type of job throughout the year and so remained employed for majority time of the reference period. It is generally believed that the access to labor market is a bit difficult for those with lower education status than the persons with higher education. But the case of Indian labor market is interesting one, as up to the higher secondary level of education, the rate of unemployment rises as the level of education increases. And it is only beyond this level of education that the rate of unemployment falls with increase in education status. This seems to be true for both the rural-urban areas. Figure 3 throws light on this fact. The figure also shows that after the higher secondary level of education, the unemployment rate in urban areas is lower than in rural areas for same level of education. This points towards the fact that urban labor markets has greater absorptive capacities for the persons with higher education. Another aspect of differences in unemployment rate is the age-wise distribution of labor force. In figure 4, we can see that the unemployment rate according to usual status among the age group 15 to 29 years, that is the youth, was much higher in 2009-10 as compared to the overall average rates. Secondly, the rate was higher for the urban youth than that for the rural youth. Further, compared to the female youth, the unemployment rate for the male youth was lower in general and was substantially lower in urban India. So, the students, let us summarize what we have learned in this module. To sum up, it can be stated that the Indian labor market has experienced a structural transformation during the last 3 decades. This has changed the composition of urban labor market. The urban labor market in India undoubtedly shows several better features as compared to the rural areas, as it has shown a greater rate of employment growth during the last 3 decades as compared to rural areas. In rural areas, the casualization of the labor force is the dominant feature, while in the urban market a substantial proportion of the workers are in regular jobs who earn relatively higher wages. Further, Dividing the labor force according to the quintile groups, again, the urban market seems to be less discriminatory as compared to the rural market. However, on the dimmer side, it is also being found that urban areas have higher rate of unemployment as compared to the rural areas. Further, the rate of unemployment among the persons with education below higher secondary and among the youth is much higher in urban areas as compared to the rural areas. This suggests that the urban labor market is less accessible for less educated and less experienced persons. Such differences need an elaborative research on causes and determinants of employment across various categories of the workers in urban areas. There are a number of direct and indirect ways in which the governments can expand entry into the labor market and improve the quality of jobs for the urban poor. These include support for health, education, and other services, as well as flexible migration controls. More direct measures include development of labor-intensive projects, greater encouragement to more productive self-employment opportunities, apart from providing social protection to the urban poor, and liberalizing rules for starting and running a business. It is important that city governments do not destroy jobs by over-zealous regulation. Given the inherent difficulties in implementing diverse legislation, municipal and national governments tend to be selective or perhaps arbitrary in what they implement. They often respond to non-poor demands for city beautification or master planning approaches. They often respond to non-poor demands for city beautification or master planning approaches, but can damage the employment opportunities for the urban poor. Municipal governments need to acknowledge the importance of informal labor market to the urban poor and operate more tolerant policies. Besides, the private sector development requires governments to provide appropriate regulatory frameworks, an attractive infrastructure investment, and a workforce with at least a basic education. It is impossible to think about opportunity without considering the underlying institutions that drive labor market formation and development. It is easy to destroy income opportunities than to create them in the way that protects the most vulnerable from exploitation. The growth of the urban economy has major implications for whether and how the economy transforms, stimulates economic activities, and absorbs low-skilled and unskilled labor. The benefits of growth would be poorly distributed if not managed properly, for which specific policy responses are urgently required. And focus on employment-oriented growth is the surest way to equitable distribution of growth. That's all with today's lecture. I hope you must have enjoyed this lecture. Thank you.